Right, and welcome to this edition of Business Redefined, your weekly most comprehensive coverage on matters finance, economics, and the business environment. Welcome. We want to kickstart our coverage of the budget cycle, and we will be delving deep into issues regarding the supplementary budget, some of the proposals we've seen in the estimates which are already being shared through the Budget Review and Outlook paper, and a few other documents. But let me introduce my guest in studio. That is Robert Waroiru, Chairperson, Public Finance Committee at ISPAC. Welcome on set, Robert.
Thank you very much, Julian.
Always glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Robert, the supplementary budget has just been passed this afternoon, and one of the contentious issues around this conversation, we don't have the details yet, but largely was around the issue of fertilizer for subsidy. The question that many Kenyans are asking is, do we even have the bandwidth for this?
That's a very good question, Julians. And indeed, do we have the bandwidth? But if you look at the circumstances that we are operating in, especially if you look at the Russia-Ukraine crisis, which has significantly increased the cost of fertilizer, you will realize that we certainly need to have a look at how we can support our farmers in terms of ensuring food security. You'll remember that one of the Big Four agenda objectives is to ensure food security. And how do you do that? You need to support the farmers. 2 years ago, the price of fertilizer was about 2,000 shillings. Today, it's about 5,800, and it's likely to even go to 8,000 in the coming days. So we clearly need a fertilizer subsidy. And really, as a country, we cannot afford to be importing our staple food. We need to be able to support our farmers. So my view is that in as much as we may not have headroom in terms of where we're going to source this funding, that is certainly a welcome move in my view.
But the question, Robert, is in light of the IMF conditions, and you and I appreciate that one of the core elements of the IMF conditions were revenue targets which are prescribed by the fund. So the government has committed that within this period we should be able to meet this, this quantum of revenue. Do you think then we have a fuel subsidy which seems to be running out based on what we are seeing, then now a proposed fertilizer subsidy on the other hand?
Well, the fuel subsidy is a completely different animal, Julians, and that's something perhaps we need to discuss in more detail. But certainly, in my view, the budgeting process has to be dynamic. We cannot bury our heads in the sand and say, because of revenue targets, we are not going to subsidize certain and critical elements of our economy. So in my view, despite what we may be told by our benefactors out there, that we need to meet certain revenue targets, I think there is a case for this kind of intervention by government, because let's look at it differently. If we don't subsidize our farmers for this, for agriculture output, what does that mean for government? We'll need to import most of these products. Now, we can hardly afford, and you can see how the dollar is behaving, we can hardly afford this kind of imports. So in my view, the lesser evil would be to scale back on your revenues, if at all that's the case, and subsidize the farmers so that at least you can inject some some liquidity into the market in terms of the farmers, the production, the entire value chain that is supported by agriculture. Not forgetting that agriculture accounts for about 26–27% of Kenya's GDP. Yeah. So when you talk about subsidizing agriculture and specifically subsidizing fertilizers, in my view, that makes absolute sense.
Robert, on the 7th of April, that is Thursday next week, we do anticipate, based on what the Treasury has told us, that Cabinet Secretary Okwori Atani should be tabling the budget statement on the National Assembly. And the big question is this. One, we have had what the Speaker of the National Assembly, Justin Muturi, did indicate, that we shall not have the budget being tabled until we have the Division of Revenue Bill passed. And then the Senate comes and says, the National Assembly approved 370 billion shillings for equitable share. We actually want 490 billion shillings. The question is, first, do you think April 7th will happen?
Well, Julians, in my view, actually, April 7th will happen. And I suppose one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, what is driving perhaps the National Treasury position in terms of April 7th? My view, and if you read what the Speaker of the National Assembly had said, Honorable Muturi, is that there is a High Court ruling. And indeed, there is a High Court ruling. I think that was petition number 277 of 2019, which decision was delivered by the High Court on 11th December 2020. Now, if you read that decision carefully, and I think it's paragraph 120, it says that it follows that the CS for National Treasury cannot in subsequent years table the highlights in the absence of a Division of Revenue Bill. In the absence of a Division of Revenue Bill. And then the orders that were given, a declaration be and is hereby issued that any subsequent tabling of the budget policy and budget policy highlights and legislative proposals without the passing, incorporation, or inclusion of the division of revenue bill is illegal and unconstitutional. What that tells me from a legal perspective is that we do not need the act. What we need is the bill. And I suppose that's where the National Treasury is coming from and saying, look, we've got the bill already in Parliament. It's being debated by both houses of Parliament, and that's fine. What I will do is that I will now present my budget proposals. And my reading of that judgment, which stands, is that what you need is a bill. So for me, April 7th, not an act. So for me, April 7th still remains a viable date for the budget policy highlights.
But Robert, to be fair, and if I could walk you back, I think it's about 3 financial years back, if you remember 2019 and the push and pull that we had between the Senate and the National Assembly regarding the division of revenue stalemate. And we seem to be heading there again, unless we have some brokerage of this kind of negotiation. Don't you think, I mean, the Senate is justified in what it's saying, and the Speaker of the National Assembly is equally justified that, my friends, before we harmonize in terms of what is going to the division of revenue kitty, the equitable share, before we get to the budget, we need to at least streamline that.
No, absolutely. And by the way, we're not saying that the Speaker and the Senate do not have a point. They do have a point. What I'm saying is, nothing stops the budget policy statement from being presented. Now, if you read the Public Finance Management Act, I believe it's Section 40 of the Public Finance Management Act, it requires the CS to ensure that the revenue and the expenditure proposals are aligned to the Division of Revenue Act. Now, and if National Assembly wants to amend that, they can only do it within the confines of the Division of Revenue Act, which tells me being presented with proposals is completely different from looking at those proposals and passing them within the confines of the Division of Revenue Act. Yes. So absolutely, let them debate, let them negotiate, and I think for this year around, Julians, I think there's going to be a big issue because that gap is about 120 billion. Yeah. So where we're going to get that gap, having just passed a supplementary budget of about the same amount, 139 billion, you know, it points to a problem in terms of our fiscal consolidation. However, the point is, even if they pass that, and for as long as the bill, the Finance Bill and Finance Act is passed within those confines, to me, I don't see an issue from a procedural perspective.
Speaking about the Finance Bill, Robert, one of the challenges I'm having with this budget cycle is that based on the experience in the recent past, we always get the Finance Bill by April 30th. We come through it, then we have the budget estimates coming mid-June. So here we are, we have the budget coming next week, for what we know. We haven't even seen the Finance Bill. So we have no idea, we have no visibility as to what revenue-raising measures Treasury is going to propose. Don't you think that's a problem in the budget cycle as it is this year?
Well, Julian, there's 2 ways to look at this. So from a purely legislative provision perspective, there's no problem because what the Public Finance Management Act requires of the CS is to publish the finance bill by 30th of April. In fact, if you look at that judgment that we are referring to, Petition 277 of 2019, it's very clear that you have to publish the finance bill by 30th of April 30th of April every year. Now, I guess one could argue that 30th of April is not yet here, so you know there's no lapse from a constitutional timeline perspective. However, I think there's a broader issue to discuss, and this is what was the policy intention of introducing this amendment in the first instance. If you remember, before 2018, the finance bill used to be presented on the day of the budget, so nobody knew what the proposals were. And for whatever reason, Parliament saw it fit that let us have these proposals out in the public. Let us have public participation, informed public participation, so that by the time we are passing it into an act, then we've had as many views as we possibly can take. And that was really the idea. So to me, for this year, because the calendar was pushed back, I think what would have been good would have been for the National Treasury or for the executive in this case to also push back the 30th April deadline, and so that we can have the finance bill to start discussing it and debating it. So that again, for the changes that are expected to take effect on 1st July 2022, people can start planning around it. Because remember, at the end of the day, what businesses people want is stability and predictability. So if I know that the law is going to change effective 1st July, then I can start planning myself, and that's what really the finance bill would be doing. So I agree from that perspective that it would be nice to have the finance bill.
All right, I see. Speaking about predictability and a level of expectation as to what to anticipate, we've been having a conversation for a very long time in this country about the national tax policy. Robert, you sit in a privileged position within ISPAC. Might you be having an idea as to where we are with this and what we should expect as we close this financial year going into another one?
Yeah, so Julian, you're right. We've been talking about the national tax policy for some time now, and the information we have as an institute is that National Treasury has engaged. I think they've had 3 retreats to discuss this national tax policy, and that just goes to show you the depth that is going into this policy document. And the rationale here is you don't want a policy that is then changing year on year. You want something that is stable for a longer term and that is going to inform fiscal decisions and policy of this country going forward. So what we know is that the draft is now complete. It is going through final review stages within National Treasury, and that should be released. In fact, if you look at the budget policy statement, National Treasury is also talking about a medium-term revenue strategy, and that is going to sort of plug into the wider national tax policy debate. So in my view, this is perhaps the good time for National Treasury to also then release this document for public participation and comment. Okay.
Robert, we're having this conversation at a time when parts of this country are grappling with a fuel crunch, and one of the questions we keep receiving is there was the Petroleum Taxes and Levies Amendment Bill of 2021. It is, I think, still within the first reading level of the procedural exercise in Parliament. Do you think some of the proposals there around changes in VAT are feasible?
That's a very tough question, Julian. So if you remember that bill, part of the conversation was let's reduce the petroleum development levy from 5 shillings and 40 cents to 2 shillings and I believe 90 cents. Yeah. I think that was one of the proposals. And then let's move the VAT down to 4% on some of these products. Now, of course, at that point, there was a lot of hue and cry in terms of the knock-on effect in terms of the prices of fuel in this country. So if you ask me, is it feasible to remove the VAT? I think that's something that National Treasury will need to think about very hard and quite fast, because if today the price of a barrel of oil is about what, $185, projected to go to $200. These oil supply constraints globally have seen the U.S. Inflation rate tick up to 7.5% in terms of growth.
A 30-year high.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a big problem, and we cannot again bury our heads in the sand. And I think we need to step back and say, is the subsidy working? And if it's not working, then what do we need to do? Do we need to say, let us pull back on some of the VATs and some of the taxes that we are imposing on this fuel, so that we can also manage the knock-on effect? I think we were discussing earlier, Julians, about the key drivers of inflation in this country. Yeah. And really, it's fuel and food. So if you cut back on the price of fuel, then you're likely to ease the cost of living for the common mwananchi, which is really what we need. So I think that's definitely something that National Treasury would need to think about really hard.
Still within that conversation, before we take a break, Robert, if we look at the tax revenue pie in this country, I think VAT constitutes about 25 shillings out of every 100 shillings raised in tax revenue. And I don't think that is a portion of the revenue which the government can easily surrender by way of reduction. But really just speak to the issue of the constitution of tax revenue in this country. And you particularly have some concerns around the share of the pie taken by income tax.
You're right, Julian. So if you look at, broadly speaking, income tax accounts for about 42 to 44%. 2021, it accounted for about 42%. 2022 is going to account for about 44%, and it's projected to remain that way until 2025, when it will account for about 46%. What does that show you? It shows you that as a country, we are taxing income. That is corporate income tax and employee taxes. Yeah. That's a main driver there. Now, VAT, on the other hand, accounts for about 23%. And if you look at other developed markets, what they are doing is that they are moving away from taxing of income to taxing consumption for several reasons. One, it's easier to administer because it's agent-based, meaning that the trader is the one who collects this tax on your behalf, yeah. And it's remitted on a monthly basis, as opposed to, for example, corporation tax, which is quarterly. It's also easier to bring in more people into the tax bracket because there are perhaps people who are able to tax plan their affairs in such a way that they do not pay any income tax, and that, that's legitimate. Tax planning is okay. But there are those who escape from the tax net. And so that's one of the reasons why you see countries moving away from direct tax, meaning income tax, into consumption tax, because you have to tax consumption, and it's very difficult for you to get. It's like fuel, VAT on fuel. You know, unless you are driving an electric car, you're not going to pay VAT. And so I think there's a need for us as a country, and this is perhaps speaks to the national tax policy, to come up with a program where we move from direct taxes into indirect taxes. And you can see what's happening with customs. The customs revenue has been performing very, very well.
Exactly.
The VAT has also been performing quite well. And you know, I know that as a country, in terms of the VAT performance, it's performing subpar, and the National Treasury has been talking about there are certain leakages within the VAT system. You'll recall the missing trader invoices and this kind of things. So there are problems, and the Treasury is working to resolve those problems. So for example, the tax invoice management system, I think that's going to be revolutionary in terms of managing the VAT leakages. So there is certainly a move, and I think I applaud that move, because that really is the way we should be going as a country.
But just to close that conversation, don't you think there's a silver lining in the sense that if you go the consumption taxes route, then whether you're at the top stratum as a rich person or at the bottom stratum as a poor person, you're bearing the same tax, and therefore the burden on the bottom person is a lot higher than it is on the higher person. Don't you think there's a silver lining in the sense that if we are largely skewed on the income tax side, then at least those who are largely consumption driven by way of taxes get a bit of a breather?
Well, you do have a point, but especially some of these indirect taxes are discretionary. So, for example, if you don't enjoy a drink, it's unlikely that you're going to pay excess duty. Yeah. If you elect to drink tap water versus bottled water, then you're not going to pay excess duty. So there's a way that the indirect tax system sort of self-compensates for the you know, it's not progressive. It's quite regressive, and I agree with you to that extent. However, I think there are solutions to that, because, for example, if you look at a country like the UK, they've got stratified rates of VAT. You have 2%, you've got 4%, you've got 14%. So is it time as a country that we seriously looked into that, and not just having this stratified VAT rates just for fuel? Is it time that we looked at having maybe essential products? Is it maybe, you know, foodstuffs that are at maybe like unga, for example, being at a lower rate than discretionary spend items? So I think there's headroom for those kind of maneuvers, if you ask me, from a fiscal policy perspective. And I think that's the direction we should be thinking about.
Right, and that point by Robert Waroro takes us to a short break. We shall be right back with a lot more on this pre-budget analysis, so don't touch that dial. Stay tuned.
As Dr. Funike and Mama Kayai host unscripted true-life relationship experiences on reality TV show Kupatana, Nia, Monday to Friday at 8 p.m. and Kupatana every Tuesday and Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. Terms and conditions apply.
Toa madoa kutoka nguo za rangi kama red, yellow, blue, yani kala zote. Lakini ni specialist wa kutoa madoa kutoka nguo za white.
There's the Toss for every laundry need. Toss ya tosha.
Black and white deodorant protects me and my favorite outfits. That's why I feel confident and free with 5 times anti-formula. I stay fresh and protected for 48 hours, and my clothes stay stain-free. World's #1 anti-stain deodorant from Nivea. Try it. Nivea's 5 times anti-action formula and 48-hour protection is also available for men.
She's going to smash the world record.
Believing in our dreams. Ndoto zetu zote zitakuja kuwa hadi tufike kilele, hadi tufike kilele, hadi tufike kilele. We're a nation of dreamers. Ndoto zetu.
Stanbic Bank, it can be.
Burgers for $6. Did you say 6? Fungua app. Ding dong, double. Your favorite moment.
Now your favorite ice cream. Ding dong, double. It's so good.
Order what you want to Taleta what you want.
Ding dong, double. Order it now. Download the app, order a Glovo, and we get it.
Ding dong, double.
I trust Sunlight 2-in-1 washing powder to give my clothes a sensational clean and an uplifting fragrance. Okay, bye-bye. Ndio hata nikiendesha truck yangu, nikirudi home, nguo zangu bado zinanukia poa sana. Sunlight. More than you expect.
Maziwa kamili asili ya Kenya.
Welcome back to this conversation on Business Redefined. We are kicking off our budget coverage. Remember, the budget should be tabled on Thursday next week in Parliament by Treasury Cabinet Secretary Ukur Yatani. So we are starting off, and tonight we have the chairperson of the Public Finance Committee at ISPAC, and ISPAC is the Institute of Certified Public Accountants in Kenya, Robert Warero. Welcome back on set.
Thank you.
Let's talk about the revenue outturn. KRA has been overshooting its targets by some good margin. But I was looking at the numbers starting January up till now. It looks like this has tapered off a bit. I don't know whether this is cyclical or what could be happening.
Yeah, Julian, that's a good question. So if you look at the revenue performance in this country, typically you've got high months. And these are the months that when you expect significant inflows. So for example, if January is typically high for people who've gotten bonuses. April is typically high because of the balance of tax payments. June is also high because of the installment taxes and so on and so forth. So if you look at a month like February, despite Revenue Authority, doing a sterling job, and I think they have done a good job. Let's agree that they have done a good job in terms of revenue mobilization. I expect that in the subsequent months, and particularly March, we don't have the numbers. April, March, we expect that they'll do well for two critical reasons. There is the balance of tax that will be payable by year-end, December year-end companies.
Yeah.
If you look at the listed banks in this country, the equities, the KCBs, they have reported very, very impressive numbers in terms of profitability. And so we expect that that will trickle down into taxpayer payments end of April, 30th of April, 2022. So I expect that there'll be a good sustained performance by Revenue Authority going into the end of the year. Now, it's also useful to note that the numbers we have as at February speak to 1.126 trillion shillings collection, and that's about 66% of the target. So if you think about the balance that's remaining, about 581 billion over 4 months, 145 billion a month, and the Revenue Authority has consistently exceeded the 145 billion mark. So my view is that they're likely to reach that target.
Not too far back, KRA released a statement giving us a sense of the performance from the ADR, the Alternative Dispute Resolution side. When you look at the numbers, about, I think, 6B or something, I personally was a bit underwhelmed. I don't know what you thought about it.
Well, I think 6 billion, to be frank, Julian, 6 billion is not a big number in the bigger scheme of things. You're talking about collecting 156 billion and you've collected 6 billion from ADR. I can see where you're talking about being underwhelmed. And I suppose part of the problem with ADR then was that the system had not been configured to support ADR, alternative dispute, no, not ADR, the the system had not been configured to support the disclosures made by taxpayers. However, I think going forward, Revenue Authority has prioritized dispute resolution so that we don't have to lock our disputes in the tribunal. Because if you remember, at some point, there are about 250 or so billion shillings locked in disputes. And Revenue Authority is saying, look, why don't we have a discussion and see what are the clear-cut issues? The ones that are clear-cut, you pay. The ones that are not clear-cut, let's go to the tribunal for determination. And I think because of that, we are likely to see a better performance this year. In fact, actually, in terms of the number of cases, year to date, I think Revenue Authority is doing better than last year. I believe year to date there are about 450 or so cases. Last year, full financial year, they had about 552 cases. So I think they're on the right track. I think they need to engage taxpayers a lot more. Nobody wants to fight with Revenue Authority. Nobody wants to fight with the regulator. So let's engage. Let's see how much is payable. Let taxpayers pay the money and let government spend that money appropriately.
Okay. Robert, another key issue at this point is voluntary tax disclosure. And just want to get your sense around, to what extent do you think it is helping KRA now push the envelope as far as revenue mobilization is concerned?
Well, so the ADR, sorry, not the ADR, the Voluntary Tax Disclosure Program is running for 3 years. So started off in 2021. We had quite a bit of people taking up that program. Even I was surprised because I had thought that a lot more people were going to take advantage of the program. However, we have seen a bit more taking it up in 2022 to date. Okay. And so even though the penalty waiver is just 50%, I think a lot of people are going to take it. And if you look at what Revenue Authority is doing in terms of the level of aggression when they go for taxpayers, I think it makes economic and business sense to take advantage of this amnesty. Because you don't want to start dealing with Revenue Authority, you know, attacking your accounts and blocking them and this kind of a thing. Yes. So there is sense in taking the Voluntary Tax Disclosure Program. And because it's open, you know, we expect that people will continue taking it up. I think next year is when it will be a bit challenging because the waiver is just 25%. So there isn't as much incentive to take advantage of that amnesty.
Okay. Robert, one of the issues which has developed in the recent past in the taxation, if I could say, regime is the issue around common reporting standards. And I think we had the regulations published by the Treasury not too far back. If you could explain to us in very accessible terms, what is the import of this?
That's a good question, Julian. So common reporting standards it tries to bring disclosure to transactions. So what used to happen previously is that as a taxpayer, especially sophisticated taxpayers, you could arrange your affairs in such a manner that you're operating in jurisdictions where the tax rates are low, what they call low tax rate jurisdictions. So, and you then avoid paying taxes where you are creating value. So, for example, let's say you create value in Kenya, but you're operating out of a low tax jurisdiction, usually the islands. So that was what sophisticated taxpayers did. And Revenue Authority never had a way of determining that Julian's, for example, is paying the appropriate tax in Kenya versus elsewhere. So what Common Reporting Standards has done is that the world has come together and said, for certain specified transactions, we want financial institutions, because those are the ones which are targeted, we want financial institutions to report, hence the name Common Reporting Standards. Mm-hmm. So let's look at certain indicative factors, bank balances, for example, insurance policies, loans or transactions, those kind of things. So we want, if somebody meets a threshold, the regulations talk about a threshold of $250,000. So if you've got a $250,000 bank balance, then your bank will be obligated to report that to Revenue Authority. And then Revenue Authority, through the information exchange protocols, can then share with the country of, where the corresponding country, what they call the corresponding country. Mm-hmm. And the idea there is that Kenya will share, and then it will also get in return this information. So as a Kenyan, it becomes very difficult for you to run away from paying taxes because Revenue Authority now can access this data. That is the whole thinking about the Common Reporting Standards. And for me, because the legal provision came into force 1st January 2022, the critical issue is, once those regulations are passed and they become effective, say June, what happens to the transactions in February and March? Will I have an obligation to report because the law was there?
Yeah. I see. Interesting. Robert, the discussion around the debt ceiling is hanging over this budget conversation. The Public Finance Management Amendment Regulations of 2022 have actually been tabled in the House by the Treasury. And there's a proposal to take us back from 9 trillion shillings of debt ceiling to 55% of GDP. Essentially, we're going back to the ratio as a ceiling of the debt. What are your thoughts on this? And how do you think it is likely to influence the budget cycle we're now under?
That's a good question, Julian. My view, and this is just from a taxman's perspective, a tax practitioner's perspective. I'm not an economist, but my view, I think, is you're better off dealing with a percentage of GDP, because that then influences the amount of headroom that as a country or as an economy you have. So that to the extent that you can grow your GDP, then you've got additional headroom to borrow. And to the extent that your GDP contracts, then you also need to contract your borrowing. And so for me, 55%, the proposal of 55% of GDP does make sense. And that compares with an absolute ceiling of 9 trillion, because look at what would happen if we hit if we approach the 9 trillion ceiling and we don't have any headroom. You remember what happened? Right, yeah, that's where we are exactly. I mean, we are just very small headroom. Remember what happened about the fiscal cliff in the US, yes. And essentially government ground to a halt because of that. So I think 55% of GDP would be ideal, in my view, from a tax practitioner's perspective. But the underlying issue, and the question that you asked is, we have a problem? The underlying issue is, what do we need to do as a country in terms of fiscal consolidation? We either have to raise our revenues, and we can see that revenue KRA is raising those revenues, or we manage our expenditure.
Which we're not doing.
Which we're not doing. So something has to give, and that's the reason why we have to budget within our we have to operate within our resources. Don't forget, and the question I think will be the reason why you're saying it's hanging over our heads. In 2 years' time, Eurobond 1 matures. Yes. So there'll be an outflow in terms of that payment or even a refinancing. So it's definitely a topical issue, and one that needs a lot of input and discussion, so that by the time we say it's 55% of GDP, when the CS goes to National Treasury, to National Assembly to say, I am exceeding 55% because of 1, 2 reasons, we've got to have very clearly defined reasons or rationales as to why that budget ceiling would be exceeded.
I see. For the sake of our viewers, let me just say Eurobond 1 is the first tranche, which was floated in 2014, I think 10-year, now maturing in 2024. Robert, staying with what we've just discussed right now, the provision that we can breach the ceiling provided the Treasury CS has explained to Parliament the grounds under which that is happening. Today there was a very intense debate in Parliament around the supplementary budget, and the question was, is the National Treasury abusing supplementary budget because of the caveat of ceiling of 10% increase? And Honorable Ed Duale was arguing that if you look at a number of these proposals, they're breaching the 10% ceiling. So maybe you can just guide us on what is prescribed in the PFM Act and what you think about how we are handling this supplementary budget issue.
Yeah, well, I think the first question about are they abusing the supplementary budget process? I don't think so. Again, budgeting is a dynamic process. So you look at allocations that have been made to specified sectors and resource envelopes, what the resource envelope that you have, and then you need to move in tandem, so that, for example, if the contracting process of a project is taking longer than expected, and you can see clearly the end of the financial year is coming and will not have moved, then it makes sense to redistribute those resources to a different sector or a different expenditure priority. And remember, at the end of the financial year, any allocations that have not been expended revert back to National Treasury. So for National Treasury, it makes more sense to bring on board a supplementary budget and reallocate these expenditures. We were just talking about the fertilizer subsidy, maybe even the fuel subsidy now that there is a view that the subsidy may have run out. So we need to be dynamic enough to change the budgeting and the resource allocation using the supplementary budget. And I take the point that you've made around the exceeding the 10%. That may be true, but the question is, what is the overall objective? And I know for those of us who talk about the rule of law, the law says 10%. So why are you exceeding 10%? But I don't think there's, if you think about the bigger picture, I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with allocating resources to places where they are going to be used, number one, and two, they are going to make an impact in terms of the economic development of this country.
Robert, we have 4 minutes to go. Let's close this conversation. One is that I've been trying to wrap my mind around what possibly could be coming in the finance bill. And I can't see any options because having covered finance bills, I think we have taxed virtually everything. What are your expectations?
Well, I think there's going to be quite a bit of clarifications, and let me just, and maybe we can discuss this at a future time. But there are certain provisions of the law that came into force 1st January 2022, whose implementation is now presenting certain challenges. And a good example of that is interest restriction in terms of interest expense for borrowers. And if you think about microfinance institutions in this country, they borrow from your deposits and they pay an interest on your deposit so that they can then lend to me.
Yeah.
So the minute you tell them that their interest expense cannot exceed 30% of their earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization, then they have a problem because about 60% of their cost is interest expense. So what you're going to then see is that at the end of this year, you'll see microfinance institutions either refinancing or recapitalizing or shutting down because you've eroded your capital by virtue of the taxes that you paid. I don't think that was the policy intention of government in coming up with this. And so we may see a cleanup around that to exclude, just the same way banks have been excluded or companies or entities that operate within the micro, small, and medium enterprises framework. Those ones have been excluded from that provision. So that's one of them. I think another one may be this whole issue of reducing tax expenditure in terms of exemptions. As a country, we've scaled back from about 6%. We are about 2.9%, yes. Which is within reason. So we may see quite a bit of these items then removed from the zero rating and exempt status. And the last one, which I really hope we get clarity on, is the whole issue of VAT on exported services, because that is a big issue. The minute you made those, the minute the executive made those services exempt, it just makes Kenya non-competitive in terms of the international scene, and everybody is going, digital or e-commerce. So the minute Kenya sees as being competitive from a BPO perspective, then we have a problem. So I think those are some of the changes that we may see. Of course, without breaching sub judice rules. Minimum tax. There may be a review of the basis of the minimum tax, even in as much as that is the Court of Appeal, because that's also a very emotive issue.
Right, unfortunately, that's all the time we had tonight, and that takes us to the close of our conversation with Robert Orero. We have been having a very introductory conversation into our budget analysis, and let me just clarify, when he talks about tax expenditure, this is the tax revenue foregone because of exemptions and other provisions by the government through various laws. So we shall continue our budget analysis, so stay tuned to NTV, stay tuned to Business Redefined. We shall be unpacking all these numbers for you.